All right, we're off and running. My name is Dale Stevens. I'm a Professor of Law at the University of Adelaide, and we are part of the Oxford Forum on IHL Compliance. It is my very great pleasure today to be speaking to Ms Yvette Zegenhagen of the Australian Red Cross. Welcome, Yvette.
Thanks, Dale.
Before we start the questions, though, let me just give a brief background about Yvette. Yvette joined the Australian Red Cross IHL program in 2011 and has been head of the IHL department since 2014. Yvette has held positions of Secretary and Chair of the Asia Pacific National Society Legal Advisors Network and has acted as the Common Law Legal Advisor for the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva. In 2021, Yvette was appointed to the editorial board of the International Review of the Red Cross. Prior to joining the International Red Cross Red Crescent movement, Yvette worked as an Adjunct Teaching Fellow in the Bond University Law Faculty and as a commercial litigator in Melbourne. Yvette is admitted to practice as a legal practitioner to the Supreme Court of Victoria and the High Court of Australia. She has a Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of International Relations from Bond University, a Master's in International and Community Development from Deakin University, and has undertaken specialised instruction in IHL from the Geneva Centre of Security Policy and the San Remo Institute for IHL. A very impressive background, Yvette, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you about issues relating to IHL and their compliance. And let me start with this one. In 2021, the ICRC Bringing IHL Home guidelines identify a number of key strategies for better realising a more complete implementation of IHL. Are you able to briefly describe for me and for our viewers, the impact of the 2019 report and associated guidelines on Australian Red Cross approaches to IHL?
Sure. So I should take a step back from that to start off with and say that the genesis for those guidelines was really as a result of a resolution that was adopted at the last international conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So they happen every 4 years. They're like the Red Cross Olympics. Humanity always wins. And they bring together all components of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, as well as all parties to the Geneva Conventions. So it's an opportunity for states and the Red Cross to recommit to a number of humanitarian issues and to provide a joint vision for how they're going to work and prioritise some of those critical humanitarian issues for the next 4 years. So at the last international conference, there was one on bringing IHL home, and it was about domestic implementation of IHL, which I think in many ways reflected, I guess, a shift from states in particular of engaging less around creating norms in multilateral settings and wanting to focus more on domestic type activities. So I think it was a reflection of that kind of environment.
Hence the title, Bringing It Home.
Yeah. Exactly. And what it did was it created, because national societies have this domestic role in disseminating and promoting IHL and working and assisting their governments to ensure respect for IHL, it was a really great opportunity for national societies to reflect on how they disseminate IHL and what their role is and what their relationship is with their government and how they want to take that forward. So it had a whole lot of different areas that we could work on. And from there, ICRC have developed this fabulous document, these guidelines that set out a checklist for states and national societies on how they can then bring that resolution to life. We've got these guidelines that really flesh it out and don't provide instruction on what states or national societies can do, but provide really useful checklists on the sorts of things that we should be considering. At Australian Red Cross, we're lucky in that we have quite a large and well-established IHL program. And so we do a lot of the activities that are set out in that resolution. But what the guidelines give us and the resolution gives us is a chance to pause and consider, are we maximising our approaches in IHL dissemination? Are we maximising our relationships and the types of stakeholders we engage with? So it provides some focus. It allows us to think about how we can deepen some of our engagement in our relationships. And it also, I think, the great thing about the guidelines is it also gives lots of examples of good practice from around the world of both states and national societies. So that's also useful for us as well. I think the main thing, or there are a couple of things that I took from the guidelines in particular. One right at the start, where it actually just talks about the importance of the conducive environment to ensuring respect for IHL. So it's not just about creating laws, though that is a very important part of this, but it's about broader engagement with a whole lot of different people that have tentacles into IHL domestically, and then making sure that all those different people are brought together and connecting with each other as well. And that's been an interesting reflection for us at Australian Red Cross, where we have all of these relationships with different sectors and stakeholders in Australia, but notice that they don't often talk to each other. So there's a real opportunity there for the national society, who has this dissemination role and who is neutral and non-political and impartial and independent and all of those great things, to be able to bring some of those conversations together, some of those stakeholders together, and I think then create a new richness in the type of conversations and ideas that are happening in the IHL space.
Absolutely.
So that's one. I think the other really great thing, very concrete thing, has been taking inspiration from British Red Cross for us, and of course the states as well, around a report on the domestic implementation of IHL. So there was one that was done for the UK that has been a really, I think, fantastic model for other states and national societies. And the Australian government, as a result of this resolution and the work that they've seen in the UK, has now commenced its own implementation report and has engaged the national society in terms of drafting some aspects that relate to our role, but also just making it a very collaborative process, which has been a really terrific outcome of the resolution, and that is then highlighted again in the guidelines.
That's amazing. Thank you for that. Yvette, one of the aspects of the guidelines is a focus on socialisation processes, and states, and I'll just quote from page 35 of the guidelines: socialisation processes in the military should not contradict IHL values. They should reinforce them. I'm interested to know, what is your understanding of that goal, and how do you think it might be achieved?
Yeah, so I think what it's getting to is the fact that my predecessor used to talk about the importance of law, L-A-W, and law, L-O-R-E. And I think that's what this is getting to, because both are needed to mutually support, reinforce, and complement one another. And one is, you've got your military manuals, your education, your training, your exercises that talk about the law, L-A-W, but then you've got the law, L-O-R-E, around, well, what does it mean to be a professional person within a military? What are the cultures, the traditions, the ways in which we relate to one another and to our identity within this institution that create the culture of a military? And the two have to reinforce one another, I think, because if you've got all these laws and training manuals and education, policies for everyone, but your own organizational institutional culture reflects values that completely undermine the values that underpin the laws, then you're never going to have really good alignment of the two and have people that are actually truly committed to and living and breathing these norms that we find in IHL.
No, absolutely. I actually personally agree with what you're saying. I think it makes perfect sense, and I think this recommendation is a good one. In that regard, it echoes in some respects the ICRC Roots of Restraint study completed in 2018. And that also identified the role of cultural values in reinforcing IHL training. And I'm wondering, given that, and I think we both agree of the importance, has there been any effort on behalf of the Australian Red Cross to modify or tweak its training in order to take advantage of these cultural foundations?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't know if we have, in a really considered way, gone about doing that. I would say that we absolutely recognise that, what the Roots of Restraint study says in terms of cultural values reinforcing IHL training. But I think we also recognise that as a Red Cross national society, it's also not our role to be shaping or trying to dictate what military culture is either. So I think, you know, that's for Defence Forces to do for themselves. But I do think we can support their efforts to do that. And I think providing the training that we do, even just exposing them to different viewpoints and different networks helps with that. So it means that you know, the ADF aren't learning about IHL or experience of armed conflict solely within their own bubble and their own frame of reference.
Yeah.
So obviously, you know, if we disagree on particular aspects of IHL, they're going to go with what the Australian Defence Force says is a proper interpretation. But I think it's very valuable to know that there are other ideas and other ways of thinking about these things, and that then I think leads to questions around, well, what does that mean in terms of the culture that we're operating in?
Sure.
I also think probably you put your best foot forward when you're wanting to interact with the Red Cross, and I think that even just that alone subconsciously reinforces to people, okay, this is how I want to be presenting myself to the world and to the Red Cross, because these are the values and the cultures that I know align with my role and my identity as a professional military person. And so what does that mean in terms of my day-to-day behaviour? So I think that's a long way of saying we haven't done anything very deliberate in it, but I do think the openness that we have in being able to engage with the military in and of itself lends itself to broadening minds and thinking about your own values.
No, I think that's both a wise, humble, and appropriate way of approaching this issue. I do wonder.
I would just say that that's reflected in the reverse as well. We want to put our best foot forward when we're engaging with the military as well, and looking like we're a credible professional outfit, and that shapes, you know, how we engage as well, and how the sort of values we hold. Because I do think there's sort of, oh, you know, Red Cross, those crazy tree hugging hippies. So you do have to, you know, shape your own values, but then also how you present yourself to the world, and that does then become other people's and your own reality.
Sure. And I think there's probably room to go further in this field in terms of recognising the ADF has now common values for Army, Navy, Air Force, and those values promote ideas such as honour and courage, and loyalty, and you can have loyalty to the Australian people, you can have moral courage, you can have personal honour, and those things which make you a military person align perfectly in complying with the law and ensuring that the violence is constrained or restrained appropriately.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes there's this sort of reaction from, you know, we see it in our own organisation as well, from lawyers where you go, but we've got the law, like you don't need the values, because what if they, you know, confuse people and they say, well, do I place honour above my responsibility under Geneva Convention, you know, the 4th Geneva Convention? Well, no, they serve different purposes, but they mutually reinforce one another. One is about the institutional framework and regulations through which I am operating as a representative of this institution. And the other is, well, how do I make that part of me and part of my own identity and feel proud and inculcate some of those laws in a way that makes sense to me? And that's where I think values can be really important.
Yeah, no, I agree. Personally, I think you're absolutely right. In that regard, do you think if we agree that they're both important, do you think it's worth identifying or differentiating between the two and emphasising one over the other in a particular context, or not? Is it more of an organic process, do you think?
I think it depends. And I would say I have never been a great black letter lawyer. So this is probably also reflecting my own personal take on the law as someone that thinks very holistically about it. I do think, you know, the role of legal advisors is to advise on the law, and legal advice is legal advice. And you don't want to get too muddy on that. You want to be really clear on what your legal responsibilities are. But I do think more broadly, the law can and must support culture and vice versa. So I think trying to create too much distinction for everyone between law and values is almost chopping off your nose to spite your face.
Yeah.
Because I think there is really so much opportunity to use the law to build good culture, and to use good culture to build good compliance with the law. And at the end of the day, for most people, they don't need to know the ins and outs and intricacies of different interpretations of different articles of the Geneva Conventions or military doctrine. They need to know how they need to behave and how they uphold those behaviours, and that that's the right thing to do. So, yeah, I think there's.
And I think you've hit on something there, Yvette. Sorry for interrupting you, but I think the idea is that where the law gets very complex, or where the law is very ambiguous, your reliance may not be on precise legal interpretation when you're there in the field. It falls back on something much deeper registers of what is it to act appropriately in these circumstances, and how should I act in these circumstances where the law is unclear and I'm meting out, violence, because that's my role in an armed conflict. So I agree with you, and I wonder if that is not where there may be room to further explore in terms of reinforcement.
Yeah, and I think as well, the law is not going to feel relevant for everyone in every context, and making them culturally relevant, be it for an Australian armed force or for a non-state armed group or whoever it might be, being able to underpin legal obligations with values that resonate with those individuals is what is going to drive compliance. I mean, you need the training as well, you need both, but without making them culturally relevant, then you're never going to get the rates of compliance and respect that you want. And at the end of the day, if IHL, from a Red Cross standpoint, is about dealing with the most difficult and complex and traumatic of human circumstances and ensuring that common thread of humanity, then having values underpinning that is really important.
Yeah. I'd like to bring it back to perhaps a more practical and perhaps even prosaic level, and that is in terms of training, in terms of Red Cross IHL training in Australia. What has proven, in your experience, to be the most effective techniques for cementing knowledge? For example, the literature out there talks about role play as having a role, and with presenters having operational credibility, both military and Red Cross and then other and NGOs out there that would teach in this area. What's been your experience with the Red Cross, the Australian Red Cross, I should say?
Yeah, so I think variety is the spice of life, and certainly the key to success with IHL training as well. So we use a number of different techniques. I think picking up on your talking about credibility, that's been a big one for us. So we realised that if we want to engage with a range of stakeholders, not just the military, but for example, corporates that are operating in conflict-affected areas, humanitarian organisations, a range of different sectors, then we need people within our own organisation that have the credibility to talk to those people. And we can't be all things to all people. So now we've got someone who has a military background that leads our engagement with the military. We've got someone that has enormous humanitarian field experience that leads our engagement with the humanitarian sector. So that, I think, has been really helpful in bringing that credibility. And there's also lots of crossover. So for example, when we want to talk to the humanitarian sector but try and get them to understand some of the fact that not everyone can come at IHL from a purely humanitarian standpoint, then it's really useful to have someone in our team that's got the military background. Or when we're talking to the military and they want to understand why humanitarians operate in a particular way, to have someone that's operated in the same spheres and contexts as them with a different hat on is really useful. So that's been a critical one. Then taking that a step further, creating trainings where you bring sectors together has been really useful. And it goes back to, I guess, broadening your mind to how other people operate and how other people think about the laws. So, for example, recently we teamed up with the Indo-Pacific Centre for Military Law, and ran a course on IHL and humanitarian legal, on international humanitarian law and other relevant legal frameworks, and brought together equal numbers of participants from the Australian Defence Forces and from the Australian humanitarian community. And the conversations that they're then able to have with each other, quite operational conversations, around the different types of considerations they're trying to weigh up when they're operating in the same environments, is incredibly helpful. Yeah. So, and it then also creates relationships that then, you know, might carry forward into the field as well. So that's really useful. The other thing we do is we are trying more and more to do simulation type training packages as well, even online ones, but where they take you through almost like a choose your own adventure type scenario, and where you've got, you know, people that they'll pop up in a video and they're, you know, general counsel for a mining company or whatever role they're playing, to try and just bring it to life for people a bit more. But I think it's also important to remember that no one has the same brain and people learn in different ways. So I think while it's great to make things interactive, and that reflects back best practice in terms of adult learning, people do like to learn in different ways. So sometimes, yes, we will stand up in front of a PowerPoint and we will give a presentation and we will talk people through the law, but then we will back it up with maybe an exercise or a video or whatever it might be, or a conversation bringing together different types of people from different areas. So I think it's just about mixing it up and making sure that there is something there that is going to bring it to life for all the different brains in the room.
Yeah, no, that's thank you for that. We're focused a little bit on Australia. I'm interested in your experience, if the Australian Red Cross has this experience in terms of international engagement, but and I guess in the region I'd be looking at. And do you think in that regard, and speak to your experience, that international military exercises play a role in reinforcing compliance with key aspects of the law, or even just creating a positive sense of a professional military identity that is more receptive to internalising the law? And I'm going back to some of the earlier comments that you made, Yvette, about identity and about being receptive to law based on a sense of value. What's been your experience, or the Australian Red Cross's experience in that field?
Yeah, so certainly I think militaries themselves, or the ICRC, would have probably a broader frame of reference to speak to that. But Australian Red Cross does engage in military exercises within Australia, which do involve other regional militaries. I think the big one is Operation Talisman Sabre, that occurs every 2 years, I think, isn't it? Yeah, every 2 years. And over time, there's been the development of a humanitarian cell within that exercise, which has been a really fantastic, I think, experiment that is growing and developing and evolving each time the exercise is run, and becoming more and more useful both for militaries and the humanitarian sector. So it's from that I make these comments. I think it's really helpful. I think you see other militaries engaging with each other. Again, it's about wanting to put your best foot forward, and show each other what kind of culture and what kind of standard you set for yourself and for the institution you represent. And I certainly have seen that watching, you know, as an observer within the humanitarian cell of those exercises. I think it allows much more sharing of best practice, but also of challenges as well, because this stuff isn't always easy and there aren't always easy answers. So being able to create those relationships across different militaries, and to be able to share those experiences and work through problems really practically together is helpful. And I think then having that humanitarian cell within the exercise is also really helpful. And year on year, we get more and more engagement. You get more and more understanding of, okay, well, there's a group of humanitarians, but actually the ICRC is different to the National Society, and the Red Cross altogether is different from the UN, and they're different from local NGOs. So, and that creates a whole lot of interesting conversations as well. So I think they do serve a really good purpose, both in terms of formal education and training and practice, but also in terms of building up those positive cultures. And I think that does reflect on the leaders within those militaries as well, because, you know, often, you know, they're the ones that are setting the standard. So yeah, from what I've seen, I've found it to be very useful.
Thank you. In that, just perhaps expanding a little bit on that, Yvette, does when you mention the Humanitarian Cell, is that an active cell? Does the role of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and others in that Humanitarian Cell, is it one of active engagement with military as the conflict is unfolding? Does the Red Cross ask questions, engage with military, seek outcomes? Is it in that nature?
It's varied year on year. So ordinarily the ICRC will do a detention visit and then report back and go through the motions of what they would usually do in terms of detention monitoring. So that's one part of it. The Humanitarian Cell will also feed, so it's part of the white cell, so it's not part of the operations, it's part of the planning and overall architecture of so we're not participants per se, but we are injecting things into the actual
exercise
scenarios and exercises. I think a couple of exercises ago, we also did a humanitarian convoy. So that was done by the National Society, and we had our four-wheel drives going into an area, you know, up north in northern Queensland, and it was a very practical way that we were helping. And then we have other people based in Brisbane providing more of the injects into the different information. It is an evolving process. There are certainly challenges in terms of classified information and what we can access and then understand where we're fitting in. But it's certainly better that we're there than not. And I think year on year, there's been improvements in terms of how we can actually provide useful injects into the scenarios.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to go back to the bringing IHL home resolution. And again, I quote from the guidelines, page 35. And what the resolution guidelines say is this. It says, the resolution strongly encourages states to make every effort to further integrate IHL into military doctrine, education and training, and into all levels of military planning and decision making, thereby ensuring that IHL is fully integrated into military practice and is reflected in military ethos. And in some respects, I think we're going back to the earlier discussion that we had, but the resolution identifies military ethos as being a target of IHL inculcation. In that regard, what do you understand by military ethos in this context, and how do you think it might be? And perhaps I'm asking you to be a little more practical, perhaps, in its assimilation with IHL principles and values.
Yeah, so I think personally, I would see military ethos more as that culture piece, the LORE piece of the puzzle. And I think that resolution actually, when it says encouraging states to make every effort to integrate IHL into doctrine, education, training, planning, decision-making, that in and of itself to me actually doesn't mean that IHL is integrated into military ethos. I think that means it's integrated into military structures and into formal settings, and that is incredibly important and it must be there. But integrating it into military ethos, I think, is way trickier. And much harder to sort of put your finger on and say, yes, we've done it, or no, we haven't, because it's those informal ways that you create a culture within a military, or within anywhere, but certainly within a military that is really difficult and requires top-down and bottom-up approaches. It requires thinking about, you know, if you are developing values or you know, hazing practices, whatever it might be, how do you do it in a way that actually reflects who you need to be when you then deploy into the field, and a way that that reflects IHL, and that I think is very tricky. And it's certainly trying to say IHL in its purest sense must be integrated into culture. You can't do that by talking to people about, you know, military manuals. That's not going to do it. That is giving them the knowledge they need about how they need to operate, but it's not going to make someone live and breathe all of those cultural pieces that reflect the values that underpin IHL. So I don't know if there is a really practical way of doing it, but I do think it's something that requires constant reflection. I think you need to create an environment where it's okay for people to call out behaviour that doesn't reflect it. I think that's really important. There needs to be a culture where behaviour that doesn't reflect it is not only dealt with, is not only investigated and taken seriously, but also there's accountabilities in place for people that don't, and not just that, you know, create, you know, have terrible violations of the law, but actually that aren't living up to the culture of an organisation as well. And I think there's got to be ways in which it speaks to the people that form part of a military, because at the end of the day, any military, any organisation in the world is ultimately made up of people. And even if you look at a military as a homogenous group and you say, well, this is a state armed force, and so this is how they operate, sure, but you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of people within that who all have their own views, all have their own frames of reference, all have their own cultures that they come from, and it needs to be sitting, you know, the education piece sits here, but you've got to have the piece that sits here as well. And I think that's really nuanced, and there's not one sort of click your fingers and it's done.
No, I think you're absolutely, you know, I think you're absolutely correct. It is an interesting conundrum, isn't it? The military occupies a privileged position in society, and that it has the capacity to lawfully use lethal force in a myriad of circumstances. So it puts it in that position. But on that point of doctrine, I would just observe that doctrine, certainly ADF doctrine, and it's publicly available, talks about not only complying with the law of armed conflict, but ensuring the moral defensibility of your actions. It also in another part talks about applying force at the direction of the Australian government, but also representing the Australian people in that action. And it does make, in my view, it does make reference to those foundations that I think does give you an open avenue for investigating what it is that I do, not acting lawfully, but also legitimately in any particular circumstance. And so, you know, perhaps there is room for further exploration.
Yeah, no, I think they're great examples, Dale. I think that's, yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we're now at the end. It's a moment in summary, Yvette, and thank you so much for your incredibly insightful views to now. But this is my final question, is perhaps an inevitable one. But what, in your view, is the optimal way to deliver IHL training? And in your view, what works best and perhaps in your experience, what works best?
I think explaining the same concept in multiple different ways. So not just standing up there and droning to a PowerPoint for 3 hours, but explaining it in, as I've said earlier, in ways that different brains will engage with, and challenging people's conceptions of the reality of the law and what it means by bringing in different viewpoints and different ideas. Because I think, even if, as I say, the purpose of the training that we do with the Australian Defence Forces, for example, in bringing in academics and ourselves and different people that talk about IHL differently, is not to change people's idea of how they're going to apply the law when they deploy. Of course not. Like, they've got their instructions and that's their position. But I think it stops people getting complacent, and it stops people thinking that there's only ever one way to do things. And it just plants a seed that these things are nuanced, that they're multifaceted, and that we all have brains and we need to engage them. And that there is a richness to be had from challenging yourself to think about things in different ways. So I think that's really important.
Fantastic. Yvette, we've come to the end of our discussion. I'd like to thank you for your incredibly valuable, thoughtful and insightful views, and for making time to speak to me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.